Hi, I'm James Dunn. Welcome to the Inside Network.
Welcome to INDepth, brought to you by the Inside Network, and my guest today is Sean Henaghan, former Chief Investment Officer of the multi-asset group at AMP Capital. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you.
Now, Sean, you were born in South Africa, grew up in New Zealand, and spent a lot of your career in Australia. So, which team do you support?
And I have a British passport, just to throw a bit more of a mix into there. But no, I'm a Kiwi. I've been in New Zealand 15 years, went into the game thinking I was supporting the Springboks and found myself wanting the All Blacks to win. So you can't make yourself change. So no, I'm a fully fledged All Black supporter now. And I always said I'd go back home to Australia when I'd go back home to New Zealand from Australia when New Zealand lost the Bledisloe. And I've been in Australia since 2002. So
yes,
I have been in Australia since 2002.
Not much chance of that happening in the near future.
I'm not so sure, actually. I'm not so sure. I think the Australians are looking like, with Dave Rennie, they've got getting a nice culture building now. I don't think it's going to be too far away, actually. And I hope it does, actually.
Has to be with a Kiwi coach. Now, Sean, your 15-month sabbatical that was planned turned into 19 months, and you very recently actually resigned from your role as Chief Investment Officer of AMP Capital's multi-asset strategy. What drove you to make the sabbatical decision, and what have you learned on your travels and your time away from the industry?
Yeah, okay, look, so my wife and I, we did a lot of backpacking when we were in our 20s, which was back in the 80s, and South America was a pretty dangerous place to visit back then. So we didn't go there, but we always had it on our bucket list to do. And we decided we wanted to do it while we were still young enough to, do the hiking and the mountain biking and the stuff that we really enjoy. So once our youngest kid left home to go to university, we thought, right, that's the time we're going to do it. So I approached Adam Tyndall back in 2016 and said, listen, I'm going to leave in 2019, March 19. I'm just giving you heads up, so I managed succession. And he said, why do you take a sabbatical? My job was merged into another business. So the multi-asset group merged with Global Equities and Fixed Income, became Public Markets. So I didn't have a job to come back to. But he just said, reach out, at the end of March, April, we'll start to talk about a new role. Of course, then COVID hit, and that slowed everything down for a period of time. So I asked him if I could extend it for 6 months. And he said, fine. And then my daughter announced that she was pregnant. So we were going to have our first grandchild back here in New Zealand. So my wife and I thought, well, let's go back to New Zealand and then head to Aussie after a month. And of course, it hasn't quite worked out that way with the border closures and stuff. But, in terms of what I've learned, I think the most important thing is that people are not going to be able to backpack through South America now for a very long time. There's a lesson to be learned, and actually don't put off necessarily. Don't plan everything for tomorrow. You need to do something today because you might not get a chance tomorrow. And, we're both so thankful that we did that. And I think it's really healthy to have time away from the industry. I'd been sort of in a pretty stressful job for the last 3 or 4 years. And when I was in South America, I totally stepped away, and it just gives you some clarity, it gives you some energy, you get enthusiasm back, because it can be quite draining. So my lessons learned is more about myself, I think, rather than any incredible insight into the industry. But, as a general rule, I'd say that Australia is incredibly fortunate that there was the foresight to build this industry back in the early 80s to the scale and significance that we have it now, because it really is a huge asset for the country and all the individual people in it.
Now, the Chilean pension funds are world famous as well. So did you feel the temptation to throw in a few days consulting every now and then while packing?
No, I didn't, actually. A few people suggested I should do that and do a bit of research, look into some areas and try to keep myself active. But I said to my wife, no, look, I'm going to completely step away. I just wanted to have that clean break and see what it did to me after 15 months, whether I decided that I didn't want to go back to work in the industry or whatever. But that certainly hasn't been the case. I'm still, really keen to get back into the industry.
With growing pressure facing the Australian pension fund and asset management sector, what do you believe needs to change in the way that Australia approaches superannuation and retirement?
Look, I think, Australia's done so much so well, right? You really need to start for that. I think they need to stop trying to fix something that isn't broken, because as a whole, it's done a pretty remarkable job. Sure, there's areas that can be done better, but I think you can find that with most industries. I think that the focus needs to be a lot more on retirement, though. I think to date it's been an accumulation system rather than a retirement system, and I think there needs to be more development in the retirement market in terms of annuities and other areas that can just help retirees have some certainty in their retirement. There's some other areas, and I think we might come to those in such. The one that I'm continually disappointed in is the obsession with short-term performance. I just don't think that's healthy for anyone to be defining success by being the top performing fund. That's fleeting, and it's never a good leading indicator. It's a lagging indicator, and I just think the system is too obsessed with the short-term performance. I don't think it's helpful for anyone.
So what's the chicken and what's the egg there? Is it the fault of the performance gatherers, the research houses, or the funds themselves? It's just the mindset.
People often talk, fund managers. I used to meet a lot of fund managers, and they'd always start the presentation with showing how good their recent performance is. And I don't want to see your performance. Talk to me about your alignment philosophy. Talk to me about some of your beliefs rather than looking at performance. And then when I was a consultant for many years, I used to try not show past performance to the trustees, because again, it would just cloud their judgment. And, it really is. Past performance is not evidence of skill. It's proof of process. And, it's such a hard, my dad's an actuary, and, he says the numbers never lie, but they don't lie, but they can mask a lot of luck. And I think it's really difficult. And the analogy that I've given in the past is, I think if you're chasing past performance, you're going to end up worse off. And I think the industry needs to start to say to a lot of members, okay, let's not try get the best performing fund enable you to get a comfortable retirement. It's much, much more important that you save enough money. What you save has a big influence on that as well. And if you just invest in a fund that delivers you inflation plus 3 over the long term, and you take more ownership in terms of how much you save, that'll be a much, much better outcome. And Paul Costello, when he got involved with the MySuper, he was trying to encourage the regulations to focus on belief statements and ensure funds complied with their belief statements, not making it all about the short-term performance. Because, and with the recent sort of proposals coming out about this performance test, it's just going to encourage retail investors or mothers and fathers to be chasing performance, and they always sell at the wrong time and they always buy at the wrong time. And I just think you need to get into a communication approach which is much more about beliefs than it is purely about how you did over the last 12 months versus the benchmark versus the peer group.
Did you foresee the rise of ESG to become really the unstoppable overarching force around investment that it currently looks like becoming?
No, yes and no. Look, at AMP Capital, we had responsible investment leaders, which most members said they want an ethical choice on the choice platform. But invariably, the money flows into that were dictated by past performance. So if they had a period of performing well, you get flows into it. And if you had a performance of relative poor performance, there were no flows. And you certainly get a lot more volatile performance around ESG. If you exclude mining and a whole lot of sort of carbon, which can go through periods of very strong performance, it has an impact. So, look, I'm really encouraged to see that growth of that, because I think there's certainly now Australian pension funds have a significant vote on corporate shareholders, so they can be a strong voice for change. And I'm encouraged to see that happening. The New Zealand government's been a bit more legislative in terms of defining that you can't invest in a whole lot of areas. Australia hasn't got to that point yet. And I'm not sure that's the right way to go, but certainly I think that the growth of this is really, really encouraging. And I think it's the big one that Australia's got to tackle is carbon, and that's a challenging one given the nature of the Australian economy.
Your career's been spent primarily working within the listed rather than unlisted entities. So
Yep.
what do you think? Are there benefits of one structure versus the other when it comes to delivering outcomes for members?
Yeah, look, that's a really, really tough question, and I think they both have some advantages. At the moment, it looks like the sort of the not-for-profit has had a good, is enjoying the tailwinds, and that's on the back of their bigger liquidity budgets and the ability to have a sort of more captive customer base, which enables them to invest longer term. And that's been a huge benefit given the performance of direct property and infrastructure, etc. I think that tailwind, though, is starting to abate, and whether the sort of the arguably the better technology and depth of some of the listed entities may benefit over the near term. But again, I don't think the industry in Australia is served by the competition between not-for-profit and profit. I just don't think, at the end of the day, as an industry, if we could have greater collaboration, more IP sharing, even staff sharing, you arguably get better outcome for the members. I think this obsession with competition, whether it be in past performance or fees, etc., it's got to be a bit careful, because it can be not a positive outcome. It can be destructive.
You've been quite outspoken in your comments around member engagement and relative performance benchmarking in the past. What are your views on the latest federal budget announcements in relation to the Your Super tool?
Yeah, look, I think the government's, I can understand what they're trying to do it, but I don't think it's the right way to approach this. Arguably, there are funds there that are underperforming, just aren't managing the money correctly, and they need to be weeded out. I don't think this is the way to do it. I think, arguably it's just going to further exacerbate this obsession with short-term performance. And with an industry, we arguably have the members' money for 40, 50, 60 years. You shouldn't be thinking in timeframes of 12 months. And I think this is going to create further risks like that. It will also create herding, which again doesn't necessarily help the end investor. And again, I come back to this point. It's about a belief statement. Explain to members what you believe in. The members align with those beliefs, and then you try to communicate to how that you're actually executing on those beliefs. And if the government really isn't intent to weed out these underperformers, there's many consultants out there that can form that assessment that they can look at and say, yeah, let's look at all the qualitative factors. And it's like a rating agency that goes into rate a bank. It's let's get some rating agencies to do this rather than having a very blunt weapon, which is purely looking at sort of fees or past performance.
Sean, your sabbatical coincided with one of the most volatile periods in investment markets in recent decades. Now, there's two questions that spring out of that. One, does the professional in you miss being at the coalface when one of these periods is happening that people will talk about for a long, long time? And the second question is, as an outsider at the time and having to watch in from outside, what lessons did you take from that experience?
Yeah, well, look, in response to that, I've been in the industry now for 30 years. I've had I was a floor trader in the 87 share market crash. That's about as extreme as you can get in terms of volatility. I was in Asia for the Asian crisis in 98. I was running the multi-asset range in 2008. And arguably, I think 2008 was worse than the current, the sort of the liquidity crisis there was pretty damaging. So, yeah, it's certainly what we've gone through in the last 12 months. But what's been incredible about this recent past is how quickly markets have bounced back. It was literally, I think a V it's sharper than a V. I don't know what you define it, but it really has been incredible how quickly it's bounced back. Depends which side of the equation on. If you're holding lots of cash, you love a crisis. If you're long a lot of illiquid assets, it can be quite terrifying. And I think your position, basically which side of the equation you're standing on. Anyone that says they enjoy it is kidding themselves. It's a really stressful period. So I didn't miss not being there. I missed sort of not being there to help my colleagues and calm members, that to be able to say, look, we'll get through this. So that was a little bit difficult, but yeah, on balance, I was quite glad I was probably climbing Machu Picchu or doing something at that time when that started to unfold. So yeah, no, it's and look, it's going to come again. I'm starting to get a bit nervous now where things are going. I'm really worried about the build-up in debt. I just don't think that's been managed correctly. Central banks are way too, they're removing risk from the equation, and I think that's going to have a consequence. So I think we're building up for potentially the mother of all issues, because there's not much left in the tank to sort it out, and that's I'm worried about that.
While at AMP Capital, you delivered strong long-term returns, ultimately benefiting from pretty sound asset allocation decisions and also manager selection. So which of those is more powerful, or is one more powerful than the other?
Asset allocation is absolutely that's, people talk about it being 90% of the return, and that's absolutely correct. And you've got to be careful when you talk about asset allocation. There's strategic asset allocation, and then there's tactical asset allocation. And arguably tactical asset allocation is quite difficult, and you'd rather there's more efficiency in manager selection, in stock selection. But absolutely, for most funds, I would say putting all your resource into having really, really strong long-term strategic asset allocation, or even medium-term asset allocation, rather than building up big teams of big managers. And I one of the lessons that we learned during 2008 is the more discretion you give to managers, the more challenging it is to manage overall portfolio risk. And what I mean by that, an example is our global bond managers, we gave them completely unconstrained mandates, and they were perceived more value in credit than they were in interest rate risks. So they were long credit, whereas the rest of our equity portfolio was long equity risk, and our bonds are meant to be defensive. And so what happened in GFC, the bond portfolio, because it had so much credit risk, just didn't provide that diversification. So at times you've got to be very careful about how much discretion or active risk you give to the managers, because it may end up, you've got to have a very sophisticated risk system to be able to be across that. And I don't always think it's a good idea. So a lesson learned from 2008, I think, asset allocation is far, far more important.
Now, 30 years of falling bond rates have provided the ultimate tailwind for all asset classes, which multi-asset strategies ultimately benefit from. But what do you believe multi-asset investors should be most worried about in 2021 and even beyond?
Well, beyond it's certainly rising interest rates. That's, as you said, we've had 30 years of falling rates. It's been basically a one-way position. Trying to get active bond managers to go short duration is not easy. They're just all grown up being long duration. It's just the bet you play. So I think that's a risk. I mean, 2021, I just think it is credit risk. I just think there is the amount of debt it's just increasing. We're not paying down debt, and it doesn't go away. And it's just everyone's on board with this, and it does worry me. And so I think for any multi-asset investor, you need to keep away from debt. I think look through whatever assets you're investing in, and just try to keep that exposure, even if it's equities. Go to a manager that's focusing on corporate balance sheets, because I think debt is going to be, if not the cause, the effect will be more pronounced where you've got excessive debt. So I think debt has to play a much bigger risk factor in portfolios than they have been in the past.
And speaking of debt, almost a kind of reverse or mirror image debt, who would ever have thought that we'd see something like $14 trillion worth of debt that is in negative rate territory?
Completely.
What's that do to markets?
Yeah, well, this is the thing. It's unprecedented. People aren't quite sure where it goes from here. I think New Zealand's now talking about negative interest rates. What does it mean for the mortgage market? I just think there's a whole, zero rates was the sort of base, and everything was priced off that. Once you start to get to negative, in theory, it may make sense, but I just think it's creating this perception that debt is free, and it most certainly isn't. I make the example that, in a way, I'd prefer to have mortgage rates at 12% and inflation of 10%. because inflation just erodes your debt, gets rid of it. You know, in 5 years, if your salary is going up by 10% a year, paying off that mortgage is going to be far, far easier. That's not the case. You have to pay this, you have to pay back this debt. And I think people are forgetting that. And yeah, I just think there's going to be a consequence at some point. Yeah, look, I have to caveat this by saying I did a lot of bond research. So I'm always a sort of getting my money back type of mindset rather than a growth person. So I'm a miserable bond person, basically, rather than the optimist equity side. So, you know, I think you need to understand that for me when you ask me these questions.
The coronavirus sell-off really evidenced the importance of rebalancing asset allocations during times of stress.
Yeah.
So do you have a view on what's the optimal frequency of and timing of rebalancing?
Yeah, it depends on the investment capability that you've got within your fund. You know, if you're a low governance fund, then you have your fixed rebalancing ranges rather than sort of, so it's a plus or minus 2% type stuff. But I think if you have a more sophisticated asset allocation medium term, you can be a bit more dynamic in how you execute in those views. But I think the discipline is still really, really important because, as you say, for a lot of people to be buying when everyone else is selling takes a lot of courage. And I think if you leave it to discretion, a lot of people wouldn't do it. And it's always shown to be the right call. So I think that discipline is very helpful with a degree of pragmatic overlay, I think.
So what's next on the agenda, Sean? When do you plan on coming back to Australia, or do you? And what roles are you seeking? And is there one such role in New Zealand even?
Yeah, look, so given that I'm sort of trapped here now, I don't want to do sort of quarantining. You know, I'll wait till once the bubble opens up in Australia, I'll then come back and start to look for work in Australia. So what I'm doing here in New Zealand is just basically I'm open to roles. I think my bias is governance related roles, you know, sitting on an investment committee or on an asset management board. But if a decent CIO gig or even CEO gig comes up, I'd certainly be interested in that. And look, it's interesting. I think both Australia and New Zealand are going to go through a very interesting couple of years. I think the amount of talent coming back to both countries, coming home with capital, with expertise, with connections, is unprecedented. Distance is not an issue at the moment because the world's operating on a Zoom mindset. So location is not a challenge. And so you may get some real bursts of innovation. And, you know, in both cases, look, if you've got these global equity managers sitting in London or New York saying coming home, so you may get a lot of these startups happening. So I think there could be some interesting opportunities, you know, and I've said to my wife, we'll have a good look here till the end of November. If nothing filters up, we'll then start to focus on Australia. It's too difficult to look for work in Australia based in New Zealand. You know, I'm doing a lot of networking here in New Zealand, just trying to see what I can shake out of the tree. But, you know, it's actually, I'm not in a rush, quite frankly. I want to find the right gig. And so I'm quite enjoying meeting people and having lots of coffees and doing my networking.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for going in depth.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me.
Our pleasure.